Life can and at times will be really tough, but God has a plan and He's working out everything for the good of those who love Him.
This is Mission 66, brought to you by TWR and the Bible teaching ministry of Dr. Luis Sayao. Today, we're stepping into Exodus, the epic story of freedom, identity, and God's deliverance. Download your free study guide at mission66.org and follow along. Here's John Matthews with Esther Sisulu to guide our study.
Greetings to you and welcome to our program in which we study all 66 books of the Bible, one chapter at a time in a way that we hope makes sense to you. Well, today we begin a new series of studies in the book of Exodus, and our adventure will lead us from the land of Goshen into the mud holes of the brick makers and later through the burning sands of the wilderness of Sinai. God leads His chosen people out of slavery and toward the promised land, but it was taking so long for Him to do that, according to what they thought. Well, our teacher John Matthews will show us that God disciplines those that are His and uses trials and tribulations and hardships to grow our faith. Our theme today will be during the time of slavery.
Esther, thank you very much, and a very warm welcome to Mission 66, wherever you're joining us from today. It's so good to be with you, where we finished the book of Genesis, and there we saw the beginnings of the formation of the Hebrew nation, starting with Abraham, and then it went all the way through to Joseph, and today we begin the book of Exodus. Now, the word Exodus literally means departure or going out. And in this book, we're going to find out how the Israelites finally departed, or actually in the end, it was an escape more than a departure from Egypt, where they were being enslaved. Now, when Joseph was brought to Egypt, he'd won the favor of Pharaoh, who was in charge at the time, hadn't he just? And we're not exactly sure who that particular pharaoh was. We'll talk about that a little bit later, Will Esther and I. But that particular pharaoh invited Joseph's whole family to come and live in Egypt as they did. And he gave them this lovely, lush land called Goshen. And they prospered there. And they raised their families. They increased in number. And things were looking pretty good for them. So the book of Exodus is the sequel to the book of Genesis, and that can be picked up straight away by these opening verses. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the descendants of Jacob were 70 persons. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the people of Israel were fruitful, and they increased greatly. They multiplied, and they grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. We see there that connection will be made between the patriarchs way back in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the fulfilling of God's promise to them. Now, that promise was that they would multiply and eventually inhabit the promised land of Canaan. Now, God's promises sometimes by our timescales seem slow in being fulfilled, but they are always kept. So we see Joseph's family prospering in Egypt, and they seem to be off to a great start. But suddenly we turn the page and we get to verse 8. Now there arose a new king in Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of Israel are too many and too mighty for us. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and if war breaks out, they join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore, they set taskmasters over the Israelites to afflict them with heavy burdens. And they built for Pharaoh store cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and the more they spread abroad. And the Egyptians were in dread of the people of Israel. So they ruthlessly made the people of Israel work as slaves, and they made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in all kinds of work in the field. In all their work, they ruthlessly made them work as slaves. And Pharaoh, like plenty of government leaders in history, feared this uprising among the people, and so his strategy was to enslave the Hebrew population and make them work so hard that they'd be too tired and discouraged to do anything against the government here. Also, the Hebrews were significantly different to the Egyptians in their culture and in their religion. The Hebrews worshipped one God, the maker of heaven and earth, whilst the Egyptians, well, they worshipped many gods. I think it's sad and all too common, isn't it, that among us members of the human race, there's this sometimes a fear of those who introduce something different into the land that we consider to be ours. And verse 15 says, "Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, 'When you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill them. But if it is a daughter, she shall live.' But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, and they let the male children live. So the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to them, 'Why have you done this and let the male children live?' The midwives replied to Pharaoh, 'Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and they give birth before the midwife comes to them.' So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, 'Every son that is born to the Hebrews you shall cast into the Nile, but you shall let every daughter live.' Government, especially when steeped in idolatry and even witchcraft, as Egypt was, feels the need to play God and exert total control over the population. And so we've seen it in modern history, and here we see it in old Egypt. First, the Pharaoh afflicts the people with heavy burdens. Sometimes those burdens we see today are excessive taxes. He institutes work programs and slave labor, providing bricks for what may have been an urban renewal project. And then he moves to attempting to murder the recently born. In this case, it was the males only. Now, that being said, human government is God ordained, and we're told in Romans 13 and other New Testament books to generally obey and respect those in authority, because there is no authority that God has not established. But human government is at best imperfect, often goes too far when they begin to ruthlessly enslave and oppress and even butcher people for expedience. And the truth is, the further a government drifts from the truth of the Bible, and by that I mean the truth of Jesus and the evidence of the fruits of his Spirit, I don't mean the manipulation of a verse to suit political ends or taking the Bible out of context. But notice here who stands out and stands up for the truth. It's the Egyptian midwives. It's they who resist the evil edict. Why? Because they feared God. They recognized and elevated the truth of God over the overbearing power of the man in charge of their country, who would possibly have been the most powerful man on earth at the time, but they still recognized in their wisdom a far higher power. And the story shows that the more the Israelites were oppressed, the more they multiplied. And you know, we are not bound by any divine order to obey an evil edict. Yet it does call for great discernment on the part of God's people, because we have to know when to obey the laws of the land out of respect for God's order and when to resist them. And in this case, in this story, the midwives, well, they resist. And because they esteemed the law of God higher than the edicts of Pharaoh, God blessed them. And let's not forget that the cost of disobeying Pharaoh in this context could have been their lives.
You're listening to Mission 66, a Bible study with John Matthews. And my name is Esther. And of course, after reading each chapter, specifically today on chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, some questions have arisen. Now, John, I wonder, at what point should we not obey the government? I think in our day we call it civil disobedience. At what point should we then take that step?
Well, this is, it's an important question, Esther, and we hear it a lot today, don't we? And increasingly so. Now, the Bible is clear in saying followers of Jesus should honour the governing authorities. Romans chapter 13 is an example of that. Any power that our leaders have is at God's mercy. You'll remember when Pontius Pilate interrogated Jesus, he said, "Don't you know," this is Pontius Pilate speaking to Jesus, "that I have the power to have you crucified?" Jesus replies, "You would have no power at all if it were not given to you from God." Now, Romans even says, go ahead and pay your taxes. Jesus says, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar. But there are times when, as Christians, we need to disobey our governing authorities. In Acts chapter 5, verse 29, it says the apostles were arrested. They were put in jail by the high priests. We're told that the priests were filled with jealousy because the disciples were filling Jerusalem with teachings about Jesus. They were giving glory and honor to whom our ultimate allegiance is due, and that is Jesus Christ. This made the ruling powers jealous. They forbid the apostles. They said, "Do not teach in the name of Jesus again." How does Peter reply to that, to the ruling authority? Peter says to that question, we must obey God rather than men. Now, we need to be honest, don't we, about our own motivations here, Esther, and the state of our own hearts, because some use this as an excuse to be disobedient and push their own agendas and their own selfish aims. But if that is definitely not the case, then there is a place for saying, no, God comes before any earthly rule or ruler. Now, you may well ask, how do I know when the time is right to disobey? Well, the answer there is simple. It is only when that ruler requires us to be disobedient to God, when the only way that we can obey them is to be unfaithful to God. To be clear, if you're a Christian, civil disobedience doesn't come from a patriotic waving of a flag or out of anti-government feeling or a particular political bias. It doesn't even come when we're inconvenienced or even exasperated by the law or draconian measures or out of some macho let's stand for our rights rhetoric. It's not about our rights. It's about God's way. So to be clear again, for the Christian, the only motivation for civil disobedience is a deep biblical conviction that obedience to man would require us to disobey God. It comes down, Esther, to this. There is a higher authority that is above human government.
Now, thinking of these midwives, John, I wonder, weren't they telling lies to Pharaoh to sort of protect themselves? Because I would imagine that people looking at this situation could think that there is an instance where it's okay to lie if it means that there would be a good outcome.
Well, it says, doesn't it, that the midwives replied to Pharaoh saying, the Hebrew women are vigorous and they give birth before we arrive. Now, we've no way of knowing whether that was true or not, but it's clear that their intentions were to disobey, quite rightly, an immoral order from Pharaoh. So humanly speaking, they do the right thing. Again, it comes into what God's order would say. What does God's law say here? So Pharaoh's edict to kill the male babies, well, that's plain evil. His intention is to weaken the Israelites, militarily speaking, and decrease their growth rate by killing all the male babies. Well, of course, you honour God in that situation and you stand against evil. And this is clearly that.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? It seems to me that it does boil down to the intentions and the motivation for doing what you're doing, right, John?
Yeah, exactly. It's why, I said a short while ago that we need to check our hearts. Our hearts are deceitful beyond all things. And so each day we need to come to God and check our motivations. God is against what is false, and he only accepts those who want to be on the side of truth. Now, we try to tell the truth about God as found in the Bible. And Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And if we're on the side of truth, we then come towards him rather than running away from him.
Okay, John, well, it may seem a little improbable, but were there only 2 midwives for this entire nation?
I doubt it, but these 2 who are named, I guess, must have been like the head nurses overseeing a much larger group of midwives. I would imagine that would be the answer to that, Esther.
Yeah, of course. And I also I want to have a look at history, right? To see if we can kind of unravel any clues as to who these pharaohs were.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Plenty of historical research hasn't been able to pinpoint the answer to that question for certain, but the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty, particularly under Pharaoh Amenemhat III, had documented famine such as occurred in Joseph's time. Now, that would have been from around 1860 to 1814 BC. But also the Hyksos period, which had some rulers which were Semitic Jewish, is another possibility. If that were the case, it would then point to a pharaoh called Apophis, who ruled from 1581 to 1540 BC. Now, because the Hyksos were held in high suspicion by the native Egyptians, they may have been the ones afraid of a general uprising. So the exact identity of Joseph's pharaoh remains a matter of debate, but the mainstream evidence would seem to point to either the Middle Kingdom's 12th dynasty or the Hyksos period. Now, as for the pharaoh who did not know Joseph, the pharaoh in this story, this chapter, that's a little trickier because we do know that Egypt had several changes of dynasties, and this new pharaoh had just dethroned the Hyksos dynasty and probably saw the Hebrews as allies of those dethroned Hyksos. So that perhaps explains why the Hebrews were seen now as a real threat to Egypt's new dynasty. But scholars, as I said, have speculated much about the specific name of this pharaoh.
Oh, it kind of seems as though slavery was a recurring theme in the history of the world, hey?
You're right, Esther. Sadly, slavery in various forms has been around throughout the centuries. And actually, the sad fact is that today, children and adults all over the world are trapped in slavery to the extent that there are estimated to be between 40 and 50 million slaves in the world today. Now, that is more than ever before. In the West, we might associate it and be familiar with the African slave trade. And it was carried on, wasn't it, by many countries, including the Americas, North and South, the British, European nations, and African tribes, indeed, who enslaved tribes that they had defeated in battle, in many ways just copying the behaviour of the colonial invaders. The truth is that slavery has been then a reality in all continents and cultures where human life is not seen in a biblical perspective. And so slavery, exploitation, human trafficking continues today, and it does so largely in secret.
Yeah, that is truly a sad reality. Well, speaking of the Hebrew slaves, were they put to work in some kind of construction project that was going on at the time?
Yeah, it does. The text tells us, doesn't it, that the Israelites here are working mainly for the construction of the storehouse cities of Pithom and Ramses in Egypt. And life is becoming harder and harder. It says, doesn't it, the taskmasters work them ruthlessly. That word ruthless is used twice. And I think it's important to point out the fact that just because someone is part of God's chosen people certainly doesn't mean that they're not going to go through hard times. In fact, on the contrary, life can and at times is going to be really tough. But God has a plan, and he works out everything for the good of those who love him. Sometimes the working out of his plan takes a lot longer than we'd like. And as we read through the account here in Exodus, we're in suspense. We're wondering, are God's people really going to be destroyed, annihilated? They're being ruthlessly oppressed. Is God's great promise to Abraham and the way that promise was reconfirmed through all those patriarchs, is that promise going to be ruined? Would God really bless their lineage, giving them descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the beach? Doesn't look likely right now, I tell you. In this chapter, this divine promise, God promising that he would also come to give these people a land, the so-called promised land. Whenever is that going to happen?
Well, we wait and we will see, John. Thank you so much for this lesson. Now let's go ahead and get to the chapter summary.
Yeah, well, today in Exodus 1, our theme was during the time of slavery. And what is the great theme in this first chapter of Exodus? Well, it is that God is working, even though it may not look like it. We see at the end of Genesis, it seemed like the line of Joseph was growing and prospering according to the promise of God. But then the dynasty in Egypt changed, and now very different picture, because the people are suffering under this cruel oppression and slavery, and it doesn't look like God is anywhere to be found. If you'd asked the Hebrew slaves who were being whipped and ruthlessly oppressed, if they didn't work hard enough, if they believed that God was about to deliver them, I think they probably would have shaken their heads and said, no chance. But behind all of this, God is in action. He would soon bring in Moses, who was to prove the great liberator who would in the end save the Hebrew people from their slavery. And that's where we're heading next time. Look, you might be suffering or feeling as you listen to Mission 66 today that you're in some kind of slavery in your life. Don't give up. Trust that God is working behind the scenes for your good, even if it feels impossible for you to see it right now. And maybe a reminder of that last verse in Genesis, that what man intended for evil, God, even if it seems impossible, intends for good.
And that is our teacher, John Matthews, leaving us today on such an encouraging note. An encouragement that I hope you will receive each time you tune into Mission 66. So thank you so much for listening. Now, before we go, friend, let me just take a moment to encourage you to follow us on Facebook and on Instagram. Simply type in Mission 66 in the search bars on both those platforms and be a part of the Mission 66 conversation. We absolutely look forward to interacting with you on both Facebook and Instagram. Now, if you'd also like to catch up on past episodes, you can find our podcast on Spotify, on Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. We invite you to join us next time as we continue in the book of Exodus, chapter 2. So until then, friend, goodbye and God bless you.
Has God used today's program in your life? Then you'll want to receive the free study guide that's waiting for you on our website. You can get it right away by downloading it at mission66.org. At mission66.org, you can also leave a comment or make a donation to help this listener-supported ministry. When you give, you're helping listeners experience solid Bible teaching in many languages in some of the most spiritually resistant places in the world. Thank you for helping at mission66.org. Mission 66 is a ministry of Transworld Radio.